The first part of my UMG for Artists and Designers tutorial series. So we're going to start off with absolute basics of the UMG editor, its different interfaces and functions, and just a quick overview of how to set up a widget. So to start with, we've got a nice blank project here, nothing particularly interesting in it. And down here in the content browser, you'll see I've already set up a widgets folder, and this is where most of our work is going to take place. So this should be familiar to anyone that's looked at our projects already. So I'm going to come inside our widgets folder, and you'll see I've already set up a test widget. This we're going to use as a sort of sandbox container for testing widgets on screen later on. But to start with, we need to have something to test. So we're going to build a new widget. This is done by coming to User Interface, Widget Blueprint, and that generates a new widget for us. So double clicking on that is going to open up our UMG editor for us. And this is where most of the work of building up a widget layout takes place. So to begin with, I'm just going to give you a quick run through of the different areas of the editor. So to start with, you've got your widget palette, and this is just a list of the available widget elements that we have for use. You see there's set into categories. You've got some basic widgets up here, different forms of inputs, panels, which are extremely important. They are containers that affect the layout of other widgets. So we're going to come back to these in more detail later on. As well as some other effects, and then right down at the bottom, you'll see any custom widgets that we've made ourselves in the user created category. Next below this, you've got your widget hierarchy. You'll also find me referring to this as the widget tree because that's how it's referred to in code. And if you look at the way things are laid out, you can see why that makes sense. Widgets are set out in a tree hierarchy based on parenting widgets to one another. And you can drag in a widget to the hierarchy either by dragging it straight into your editor area or onto the tree itself, onto the widget you want to be its parent. Keeping track of what's parented to what is quite important for UMG as it will affect your layouts. Down below this, we've got our animations panel, and I'm going to come back to animations separately later on as it's a slightly more complicated topic. So animations panel and the timeline which goes with it, we're going to leave them for just now, but this is your area for setting up timeline based widget animation. Over here is one of our most important panels, your details tab, and this lets you deal with everything from your widget's name up in here, where it's laid out, its size. As you can see, you can do some things by dragging handles around for size if you prefer to do it that way, or you can do it numerically if you want to be more precise. Also deals with alignment, anchoring, a topic we're going to again get back to later on when we go into more details on the canvas panel. Then you've got things like padding, colors, behaviors, whether something's enabled or not. You can disable most widgets, which will cause them to have no interaction when the game is playing, and they'll also generally, unless you've overridden it with custom settings, be overlaid with a sort of grey filter. Visibility, likewise, can be set individually for any widget, and at this point I'm going to point out that visibility in the details panel here and the show hide function over here in the widget hierarchy are two different things. Your widget hide in the hierarchy only affects visibility in the editor. It will not affect your game at runtime. Visibility here will affect your game at runtime. So if you're looking for actual in-game visibility of something, you've got to use your visibility tab over here in the details panel. Render transforms, fairly straightforward. It allows you your basic transformations. You can do these on any widget or layer of your widget. Behaviors, we've covered enabled, and that's your major ones here. Clipping is an interesting topic as of the latest version of Unreal, so we're going to go into that in a little more detail later on, as you can now allow certain widget elements to render outside of your widget bounds, which has some interesting implications for layouts, but you've also got to be careful that you don't end up with too much overlap going on. Navigation is generally something you can leave alone, so I'm not really going to cover that panel just now. Events, however, are quite important. So, to show you events, I'm just going to drag a broadcast button down here, and you will see that when it's dragged down, because it's an input widget that receives inputs from the user, we get a whole bunch of events pop up in this panel, represented by green buttons. Later on, I'm going to work through finding actions to these events, so that you can have your widget do something when, say, your button gets hovered, which is quite handy for testing out widget animations. So that's the general layout of your details panel. We've also, at the top here, got another tab, which is your graph tab, and whilst most of the stuff in this tab is more coder territory, there's a couple of things that are useful for doing layouts. So I'm just going to quickly go over them. Down here in your details panel, if you go to class defaults, you can see there's one here called preview background. Now, this is where you can set an image. I'll just use this blank image for just now as a background here in the editor panel. And this is most useful for applying a mock-up of the screen you want to build as this background to aid you in lining up your widget elements when you build your live screen. If you want to turn this off, just come back on down to your class defaults tab and just hit this yellow arrow, which is your reset to default, and you'll see a lot of the dialogues here in the UMG editor have got this option. So default in this case is no background, so it will clear the background again for you. The second thing I have to go over in this area is one of the more complicated areas of widget editing, and this comes into play when you're working on a widget that already has some code attached. So a widget with code will have a class name, a parent name, in this area here. And if you're going to edit this widget, the important thing to do is, before you do any editing, especially deleting or renaming elements, which will cause your editor to crash, is come on in here and change its parent back to user widget. And that is the blank widget default parent. This effectively detaches your widget from its code class so that you can do all your visual editing without any of the code stuff getting in the way and causing your editor to crash because it can't find something it's looking for. At the end of your editing, you can come back down here, select your widget's code class, and reparent it so that your code will work again. This is the safest way to edit layouts that have already got some kind of code attached to them. That pretty much covers areas that you'd generally be editing over here in the graph panel for typical widget layout editing. So let's go back to the designer panel, and here you've got your general editing area. The final area I'm going to cover for your editing panel is your options up here, particularly this one up here in the top, which is your preview screen size. Now, this is going to depend on what size of screen you're using. Full screen by default will give you a 1080 standard shaped screen rectangle, but it's not a good idea always to rely on that. Also should be noted that if you set a custom size here, say 1000 by 1000, your canvas area in the editor will be resized, but this is no guarantee of the final size of your widget on screen. This is only a preview size and should be treated as such. It's good for working out your layouts, but don't assume that anything you automatically drag onto the screen will come out at this size. If just now I was to drop this widget onto the screen, it would be stretched out to fill the whole screen because it's not inside a container. So remember that your sizes up here are preview only and not final. Finally, up here you have your compile and save. If you're working with code-based widgets, it's important to compile every now and then to let your code run and update your widget appearances. And then save goes without saying. I'm not going to play this one just now because we haven't set this widget up for preview play yet. So we're going to work on that just now. Here we've got our default level, which I've already set up to behave much the same way as our project default level does. So that if you go up here to blueprints and open level blueprint, you will see a string of blueprint nodes looking like this. And this is the only little bit of blueprint editing you should probably have to do normally. It's just a quick preview way of looking at a widget running in game. So, quick run through of what it does, it's all explained in the comments. We clear up any widgets that have been added to the screen in code. We select the widget that we want to preview from this drop down here. That creates a copy of our widget. This node here adds it to the screen. So now, compile and play, and you'll see this little widget with the rectangles that I have made displayed on screen. And as you'll see, it is kind of stretched out. It's not a nice square in the middle or anything like that. Now, if you're doing this in an active level, if you're not using the preview, just take this pen from the Begin Play tab and attach it over here to where your other level nodes start. That'll disable our code that adds our test widget to the screen. If you want to use the test widget function again, you just take that pin and connect it up here instead. The white line determines which way the code will flow. So right now, we're going to leave the test widget set up in place because we're going to be coming back to that later on. Okay, so that pretty much covers Introduction to Widget Editor, and I'll be back with more videos.